Hello and welcome to you, wherever you may be, and a happy new year to you. Happy 2026. This week I've got some readings from Mr. Gurdjieff about his image of the centers being reels which wind and unwind impressions. I'll read something out about that. And I also visited Greenwich Maritime, the museum, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end maybe. I was with some friends a couple of weeks ago, a man and a woman, and we were chatting about things, and the woman was trying to remember something in her memory and it vanished. And they laughed about it. They laughed it off. And I said, no, hang on a minute. And I got the man to repeat exactly what he had been saying previously, with all the details. One thing after another thing after another thing. And then the woman remembered. Because it triggered her memory. And she remembered, and she was telling us about some acquaintance that she met years ago who had certain interesting quirks. I made him repeat what he had said, and it had pulled out of her reels a memory, because that's how it works. And in fact, a large amount of human life is based upon these mutual associations, these shocks, these connections that people have with each other, because in this era human beings are less soul beings, less will beings. They act less from themselves and they act more mechanically, as Gurdjieff has described. But it's not very easy to see it because you have to be at a slightly higher level to actually see the operation. If not, you're fully immersed in the dream. You're submerged in it. Enough from me, let's hear Mr. Gurdjieff. Man is born, it is said, with a mechanism adapted for receiving many kinds of impressions. The perception of some of these impressions begins before birth, and during his growth more and more receiving apparatuses spring forth and become perfected. The construction of these receiving apparatuses is the same, recalling the clean wax discs from which phonograph records are made. On these rolls and reels, all the impressions received are noted down from the first day of life and even before. Besides this, the mechanism has one more automatically acting adjustment, thanks to which all newly received impressions are connected with those previously recorded. In addition to these, a chronological record is kept. Thus, every impression which has been experienced is written down in several places on several rolls. On these rolls it is preserved unchanged. What we call memory is a very imperfect adaptation by means of which we can keep on record only a small part of our store of impressions. But impressions once experienced never disappear. They are preserved on rolls where they are written down. Many experiences in hypnosis have been made, and it has been stated with irrefutable examples that man remembers everything he has ever experienced down to the minutest detail. He remembers all the details of his surroundings, even the faces and voices of the people around him during his infancy, when he seemed to have been an entirely unconscious being. It is possible by hypnosis to make all the rolls turn, even to the deepest depths of the mechanism, but it may happen that these rolls begin to unroll by themselves as a result of some visible or hidden shock. and scenes, pictures or faces, apparently long forgotten, suddenly come to the surface. All the internal psychic life of man is nothing but an unfolding before the mental vision of these roles with their records of impressions. All the peculiarities of a man's world conception and the characteristic features of his individuality depend on the order in which these records come and upon the quality of the roles existing in him. I just note here that he says, inside the mental vision. And if we listen carefully, there are just mountains of information there. One thing I would say is that our lives are the unfolding of these associations of the centers. The centers are functioning, and that is our life. The centers represent different strata of energy. The intellect is higher than the emotions, is higher than the moving center. That's how they're stratified. They overlay one another. But if you're sensitive, you can sense the difference in the transmitted energy. In the same way, in a typical pop song, there is a manifestation of the intellect, in other words, the lyrics, or there's the melody, and then there is the bass and rhythm. And when you listen to music, it's actually going to the different centers, and perhaps even more than 3. But we cannot live consciously and deliberately and with our will all the time. When we do, things move forward and our centers work in a certain way. When we are more relaxed, we're taking a break, then it's as if they wind backwards. But the engine, the cosmic engine that is what we are, does not stop living. It's not like a car where you park it and take the key out and the engine is dead. No, a living being continues to live whether he's working with his will or is taking his foot off the gas and freewheeling, or even if he's never really been introduced to himself or to the concept of actually having a destination and aim. I'll continue. We are like a clock. Our system is already established. Each man has different springs. If heredity is different, the system is different. For example, a system may be calculated for 70 years. When the mainspring runs out, life comes to an end. But another man's mechanism may be calculated for 100 years, and it is as though he was made by another craftsman. So each man has a different time of life. We cannot change our system. Each man remains as he was made, and the length of our life cannot be changed. The mainspring runs down, and I am finished. In some person, the mainspring may only last a week. Length of life is determined at birth, and if we think we can change something in this respect, it is pure imagination. To do this, one would have to change everything. Heredity, one's father, even one's grandmother would have to be changed. It is too late for that. But there is a possibility to live longer. I said that instead of 24 hours, the mainspring can be made to last a week. Or it can be the other way around. If a system is calculated for 50 years, the mainspring can be made to run down in 5 or 6 years. Each man has a mainspring. It is our mechanism. The unwinding of this mainspring is our impressions and associations. Only we have 2 or 3 coiled springs, as many as we have brains. Our brains or our intelligence as the centers correspond to springs. For instance, our mind is a spring. Our mental associations have a certain length. Thinking represents the unwinding of a reel of thread. Each reel has a certain length of thread. When I think, the thread is unwinding. My reel has 50 yards of thread. He has 100 yards. Today I spend 2 yards, the same tomorrow, and when 50 yards has come to an end, my life too comes to an end. The length of thread cannot be changed. But just as a 24-hour mainspring can be unwound in 10 minutes, so life can be spent very quickly. The only difference is that a clock usually has only one spring, whereas a man has several. To each center corresponds one spring of a certain definite length. When one spring has run down, a man can go on living. For instance, his thought runs out at 70, but his feelings at 40. So after 40 years, he lives without feeling. The only thing we can do is to economize. Time is proportionate to the flow of associations. You can easily remember such facts. You sit at home, you're calm. You feel that you've been sitting there for 5 minutes, but the clock shows that an hour has gone by. At another time you are waiting for someone in the street. You're annoyed that he does not come and you think you have been waiting an hour, whereas it is only 5 minutes. It is because during this time you had many associations. You thought, why does he not come? Maybe he has been run over, and so on. The more you concentrate, the quicker the time goes. An hour may pass unnoticed because if you concentrate, you have very few associations, few thoughts, few feelings, and time seems short. Time is subjective. It is measured by associations. When you sit without concentration, time seems long. Externally, time does not exist. It exists only for us internally, just as in the thinking center, associations go on in other centers just the same. The secret of prolonging life depends on the ability to spend the energy of our centers slowly and only intentionally. Learn to think consciously. This produces economy in the expenditure of energy, and don't dream. Well, I certainly noticed that in the morning, about an hour after breakfast, I am at my most receptive and I have a lot of bright ideas. Presumably that's because the springs are slightly tighter, more sensitive after a night's rest. And certainly the mobile phone, social media, Twitter and so on, these are places where you go to completely destroy your entire mechanism. This morning I felt a terrible kind of fear, sort of dread, and it was after I had been on social media a while. And I think what happens is that your rhythm of life gets disrupted, and because of that you can't really feel your identity, nor the real world, and then you become anxious in that existential gap. And the false world, which is always very dramatic, is of a different circulation. It is that second consciousness which is false. I was going to talk a little bit about universities and why Gurdjieff considered them the destroyers of culture and their replacement with what he called 1.5 day tasty lentil soup. In an earlier time, in this country, teaching happened in monasteries, or it came from a different line, the line of the guilds, which perhaps is more distinctively European. And so the work and the thing in itself was the institution of teaching, but at a certain time it broke away and became its own business. That's the problem. It is just another example of a broken octave, just manifested at a different part of the cosmos. Let me read this. I think this may be Orage speaking here. Although Gurdjieff tempered the wind to his shorn lambs, to each a chance according to his state of being and understanding, his shocks annoyed some. People think that a man can be taught in a real school as at a university, universities being now no more than reformatory apparatuses for conventional science, art and literature. whereas their original function was to teach the universals. The torn-off mask, says Lucretius, lays bare the thing that is. Persona means a mask, and the idea comes from objective schools. Gurdjieff said, kill our personality, the false thing which we think is us. It has to die so that individuality may grow. To achieve his aim, Gurdjieff, like all real teachers, had to play a role, playing at the same time several ancillary or sub-roles, working on himself for his own development. While spreading his teaching, he had to adapt it to people of different levels of development. In a group at meal times, for example, he used hyperbole, exaggeration, joking, seeming contradiction, saying something to one person while meaning it for another, which was bewildering to some, who often took him literally and made strange statements on what they had misunderstood. But I have come to different conclusions to Gurdjieff. I think he did not quite get to the goal, and he suffered like most religions and spiritual people through the ages have suffered from a very fundamental problem. What it is that you call the false self. What is your explanation for it? Why is it there? Is it there for no reason? Shall we discard it? Shall we ignore it? Shall we call it false? This has to change. I think here it seems to me that Gurdjieff was in fact quite Western. I did go and visit Greenwich Maritime Museum, which is on the east side of London, along the estuary of the Thames as it reaches out towards the sea. It was a beautiful sunny day. It's a lovely place to visit. We were heading to the Pirates exhibition they had on. But first, let's have a look at the grounds of this building. You can see how beautiful and elegant a traditional and integral living society is. What they make reflects their own inner order. Their buildings reflect their order. Ordering according to the notes of the octave or according to the castes. Each man having his place and the ship bringing everybody home. It was pretty good fun, really. Not too serious. I go to see, and I'm sure most people go to see, the wild romance of the pirates. Living free on the ocean and having all sorts of capers and adventures. Of course, in the museum, underneath every photo and every piece, there was a warning about how irresponsible all of this really is. I tend not to read that stuff. And that's the conflict between the real self and the false, isn't it? Between the containment, ordering and channeling of our power and the wild horse within us. Well, it was a little bit woke, but not too much. I'm sure they didn't want kids crying, and they wanted to give them at least a little bit of Captain Jack Sparrow, even if it is against health and safety. And we were about to leave when we decided to walk to the less frequently visited top floor. And what did we find there but the real museum, with the real history of this nation, the real majesty, the real glory and courage and the mystery. The mystery of the adventures of the actual British, which are quite considerable. I think that's enough for this week. Please take care.
silent grief oppressed. Britannia mourns her hero now at rest. But those bright laurels ne'er shall fade with years, whose leaves are watered by a nation's tears.